The judge went pale when Tyler took a camera out of his pocket, revealing a truth he never imagined would be exposed. The boy, wronged, not only exposed the judge but an entire system of manipulation. But something even bigger was yet to come. The courtroom was suffocating. The air felt thick with anticipation, as though the walls themselves were closing in on the small figure of Tyler sitting at the defendant's table. He was alone, surrounded by cold, unforgiving space, his heart hammering painfully against his ribs. His hands gripped the edge of the table tightly, nails digging into the wood as he tried to steady his breathing. Every inch of his body was taut, his muscles stiff with the weight of the moment. He could feel the judgment radiating from the room, seeping into his skin. His clothes, too big for him, hung loosely around his wiry frame. His posture was slumped as he fought to hold back the overwhelming wave of emotion threatening to spill over. His lips were parched, and the heat of the room pressed against his chest like a vice. His eyes were trained on the figure of the judge, a man whose piercing gaze seemed to bore into his very soul. The judge was a tall, imposing figure, a man with sharply cut features, pale skin, and graying hair that seemed too deliberate, too neat. His name was Judge William Harris, a man whose reputation for fairness was merely a facade, a mask to cover the prejudice that lay beneath. His eyes were cold, calculating, as if he saw no humanity in the young black man standing before him. Tyler could feel it, the disdain in the judge's eyes, the way his lips curled in a barely there sneer whenever Tyler spoke. It wasn't hidden. The bias was obvious. And it burned like fire. The air felt heavy, thick with the smell of stale paper and formaldehyde. The room smelled sterile, yet the weight of injustice suffused the atmosphere. Tyler could taste it, he could taste the bitterness of it, sharp on his tongue, a metallic tang that lingered even after he swallowed. It made him nauseous, but he couldn't look away. He couldn't let himself show weakness. Not now. The prosecutor stood, towering over Tyler as he laid out the charges: theft. They accused him of stealing something he didn't even touch. There had been no evidence. No motive. But they had accused him anyway, based on nothing more than the color of his skin. The prosecutor's voice was sharp, biting, each word meant to wound. Every glance cast in Tyler's direction felt like an accusation, each breath from the prosecutor filled with condescension. And then, the judge, Judge Harris, spoke, his voice cutting through the heavy silence of the courtroom. It was cold, detached, as if he was merely reading from a script. Mr. Tyler Evans, Judge Harris's voice echoed through the room. Your reputation precedes you, does it not? Or perhaps that is simply the kind of behavior we can expect from someone like you. Tyler's heart sank. It was subtle, but he knew exactly what the judge meant. His skin. His race. That was all the judge needed to form an opinion. No matter how many times he protested, no matter how many times he said he was innocent, the judge wasn't listening. Tyler's truth didn't matter. He could feel the anger burning in him, threatening to rise. But he kept it in check. He had learned long ago that anger wasn't a luxury he could afford. Not in this courtroom. Not with someone like Judge Harris presiding. The words continued to swirl around him. He couldn't focus. The unfairness of it all was suffocating. The judge's thin lips tightened in an almost imperceptible smile. It was a smile full of contempt, full of judgment. It made Tyler's blood run cold. Mr. Evans, the judge continued, you stand accused of a crime that you clearly committed. And yet, despite all the evidence against you, you continue to deny it. There was a brief pause, and the judge's eyes narrowed further. Perhaps you think you're above the law, that your actions can be excused because of where you come from. Tyler clenched his jaw, his hands trembling. He wanted to shout. To demand justice. But he knew better. His voice had no power here. Not when it was being drowned out by the weight of systemic racism, not when his life was nothing more than a story to be manipulated by those who held the reins of power. His eyes darted to the defense attorney, but there was nothing in the lawyer's eyes but resignation. The case was a lost cause. Tyler had already been condemned. The trial was nothing more than a formality. The judge's gavel slammed down with finality, the sharp sound echoing through the courtroom like a death knell. He had made his decision. And Tyler knew, deep down, that the verdict had already been written. But just as Tyler prepared for the inevitable, something unexpected happened. His hand trembled as it slid into his pocket. He didn't think. He wasn't sure what possessed him in that moment, but his fingers wrapped around the cold, familiar shape of the camera hidden inside. His eyes locked onto the judge's face as he slowly pulled the device out of his pocket, his breath catching in his throat. Judge Harris's eyes widened in disbelief as Tyler held the camera up for all to see. The room fell silent. The atmosphere shifted. A sense of dread hung in the air. Tyler could see it then, fear. Fear in the judge's eyes. The camera. The very same camera that Tyler had secretly used to record the unethical behavior of Judge Harris. The moments when the judge had displayed his bias. The moments when the judge had made decisions based on race, ignoring the facts and the law. The moments when the judge had whispered cruel things under his breath, convinced that no one would ever know. But Tyler knew. He had captured it all. Judge Harris's face went pale. His once confident demeanor faltered, and in that moment, Tyler saw the true depth of the judge's guilt. The power dynamic had shifted. The gavel that had once come down with authority now seemed to tremble in the judge's hand. The room was alive with murmurs, eyes darting from Tyler to the camera, to the judge. The truth had been exposed. And in that instant, Tyler knew that his fight for justice wasn't over yet. The judge's power was no longer absolute. And Tyler wasn't the only one who had been trapped in a system that didn't care. The silence in the courtroom was deafening, thick with an intensity that made it seem like time had frozen. The sharp click of the camera as Tyler pulled it from his pocket echoed louder than any voice could have. His hand shook as he gripped the device, the weight of what he was about to reveal pressing down on his chest like a leaden weight. Tyler's eyes remained fixed on Judge Harris, who was now staring at the camera in disbelief. The judge's face, once confident and cruel, now drained of color. His pale skin seemed to lose all its former rigidity, the arrogance that had previously set his features now replaced by something softer, something Tyler couldn't quite name, but it was unmistakably fear. For the first time, Tyler saw the cracks in the facade. This man, who had judged him, condemned him without a second thought, was now on the edge of something that could undo everything, the truth. Tyler felt his heartbeat quicken, the adrenaline flooding his veins, and the weight of what had been building inside him for so long felt unbearable. He had been wronged. He had been treated like a criminal simply because of his skin color, and now, the truth was going to surface. He was ready to expose it all. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The prosecutor, once so sure of Tyler's guilt, now stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, unable to speak. Even the defense attorney, who had been so quiet throughout the trial, looked stunned. They all stared, eyes wide with disbelief as the camera dangled in Tyler's hand. Judge Harris finally broke the silence, though his voice was no longer filled with authority. It wavered, unsteady, as if the words were foreign to him. What is this?" he asked, his voice small, uncertain. Tyler's lips curled into a faint but powerful smile. The moment was sweet. After all the humiliation, after all the rejection and accusations, the truth had finally found its place. The camera in his hand was not just a piece of technology, it was his salvation. The evidence he had gathered in secret for weeks now was exposed, and there was no turning back. "I think it's time for you to see what I've been recording, Judge," Tyler said, his voice steady, cutting through the tension in the room. "You've been accusing me of something I didn't do. But I've been recording something far worse." The judge's eyes flickered nervously, the color draining further from his face. He glanced around, as though hoping for someone, anyone, to come to his rescue. But no one moved. The room was still, and every eye was on him now. Tyler could almost taste the irony in the air. The judge had made his career judging others, wielding power over the lives of those who walked into his courtroom. But now, it was his turn. His own actions, his own behavior, were being scrutinized, and there was no way out. Tyler clicked a button on the camera, and the room was suddenly filled with the unmistakable sound of a recording starting. The screen lit up, and the image of the judge, caught in moments of unguarded cruelty, filled the room. There was the moment when Judge Harris had dismissed Tyler's testimony without even looking at him, as if the young black man had no worth. There was the instance when the judge had made dismissive comments under his breath about Tyler's appearance, laughing with a colleague about types like him. And then came the worst of it, the part Tyler had kept hidden, even from his defense lawyer. The footage showed Judge Harris in an uncharacteristic display of hostility, speaking to Tyler in a tone so low and cruel that no one would have believed it if they hadn't seen it. "You people always think you can get away with anything," Judge Harris had muttered, just loud enough for the mic to pick up. "This case is just another example of a kid who thinks he's above the law." The room was silent except for the faint buzzing of the camera's playback. Tyler stood tall, his heart still pounding in his chest, but now a sense of calm had washed over him. The weight of the injustice was no longer a burden he had to carry alone. He had exposed the truth. Judge Harris, on the other hand, looked as though the ground beneath him had crumbled. His face was an ugly mixture of shock, anger, and fear of being caught, of his reputation falling apart, of everything he had worked for being torn down in an instant. He took a step back, as though trying to retreat into his own privilege, but there was no escaping the reality Tyler had thrust upon him. The gavel on the judge's podium thudded loudly as Harris's hand trembled over it. He cleared his throat but couldn't find his voice, not this time. The arrogance, the confidence with which he had presided over countless cases, had evaporated in an instant. The man who had dismissed Tyler, who had made cruel, sweeping judgments based solely on the color of his skin, now stood paralyzed, his actions hanging in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. For a moment, Tyler saw the judge's true self, the man who hid behind a robe, using his power to manipulate those who were already vulnerable. He saw through the layers of the judge's public image, the polished veneer that had been so carefully constructed. Tyler felt no satisfaction in it, though. He wasn't doing this for revenge. He wasn't interested in humiliating the judge, though it seemed fitting. What Tyler wanted was justice, not just for himself but for every other person who had been unfairly judged in this very room. Tyler's fingers tightened around the camera, and he lifted his chin slightly. "This is what true justice looks like," he said, his voice firm, resonating through the courtroom. "You may have thought I was an easy target. You may have believed you could treat me however you liked. But I'm not the one who should be afraid here." The judge's pallor deepened. He couldn't respond. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. His power was slipping away, replaced by something more fragile than he had ever anticipated: vulnerability. The truth was now undeniable. Tyler had not only proven his innocence, but he had also revealed the ugliness that lay behind the walls of the courtroom. The place that was supposed to be a sanctuary of fairness had instead become a stage for abuse. And Tyler had turned the tables. The courtroom was still. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Every pair of eyes was glued to the small screen that flickered in Tyler's hands, showing the damning footage of Judge Harris's appalling behavior. It was as if the room had transformed into a pressure cooker, with the heat building up slowly and painfully. The judge's face had gone an ashen color, so pale that it looked unnatural. His lips, once so self-assured and tightly pressed, were now trembling. His mouth moved as though he were trying to form words, but nothing came out. The gavel in his hand rattled slightly, almost as though it had betrayed him in that moment. It was his symbol of power, his way of controlling the courtroom. And now, it seemed like the very thing that had been a constant for years was slipping out of his grasp. "Your Honor," Tyler's voice rang out, calm and steady, contrasting the judge's stammering. "Do you hear it? The truth? All those things you've said about me. Do you see what you've done?" Tyler stepped forward, the camera held high for everyone to see, though he was focused on the judge's face. "You may have thought that because of the color of my skin, I was just another defendant to be discarded. But you were wrong." Tyler's heart thundered in his chest, but there was no fear. There was nothing left to fear. The judge had underestimated him. For weeks, Tyler had sat quietly, watched the trial unfold, observed the way the judge dismissed his defense, the way he allowed bias to control the outcome, not caring about the truth or facts. Now, Tyler was in control. He held the power, the undeniable proof of the judge's corruption. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, Tyler felt free. Not just from the accusations that had been leveled against him, but from the constant weight of being judged based on the color of his skin. The world had always seen him as an outsider, a person who didn't belong, who didn't matter. And now, he had the chance to show the world how wrong it had been. "You're a disgrace," Tyler continued, his voice unwavering. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. The quiet certainty in his words held more power than any scream could. "This isn't just about me. This is about everyone who's been wronged by people like you. People who wear a robe and hide behind the law, pretending they are just and fair when they are anything but." The prosecutor, still standing to one side, shifted uneasily. The truth was out in the open, and now there was no way to deny it. He exchanged a look with the defense attorney, who had gone completely still, seemingly unsure of how to react to the shift in power. The judge, his face now flushed with rage, tried to compose himself. He reached for his gavel, but his hand faltered, unable to grip it with the same authority he once had. His entire demeanor was slipping, his carefully constructed persona, his reputation built on decades of perceived fairness, was crumbling before his eyes. "Enough!" Judge Harris finally shouted, his voice cracking. This is preposterous. You can't do this." But Tyler wasn't intimidated. He had been fighting for this moment for far too long to let fear creep back, and now. The years of prejudice, the moments when he had been called a liar, the time spent waiting for justice that never came, all of it had led to this. He was no longer the frightened boy who had walked into the courtroom. He was someone else now. He had power, and he wasn't about to give it up. "I can and I will," Tyler replied, his gaze never wavering. "The law doesn't belong to you. You don't get to decide who deserves justice. Not anymore." The tension in the room was unbearable, thick as smoke and heavy with the smell of sweat. The other members of the courtroom were silent, their eyes darting between Tyler and the judge, the weight of what had just unfolded still sinking in. The room felt colder now, a stark contrast to the heated atmosphere that had been there only moments before. Judge Harris's face twisted into something ugly, something desperate. He had been exposed, and the reality of his actions was crashing down on him like a tidal wave. He had spent years assuming that the law, the power, and the privilege he held could shield him from accountability. But Tyler had shattered that illusion. The judge turned away, his hands trembling as they reached for a stack of papers on his desk. He was grasping at anything, trying to find a way out of the corner Tyler had forced him into. But there was no escape now. The truth had already been set free, And nothing could take that back. Your Honor, I suggest we take a step back and review this footage, the defense attorney finally spoke up, breaking the silence. His voice was hesitant, but it held an edge of authority, as though he could see the possibility of a different outcome now that the truth had been laid bare. He was no longer afraid to speak up. Tyler didn't look at the lawyer. His focus remained on the judge, whose earlier defiance had evaporated entirely. The gavel, once such a symbol of power, now seemed useless. It was nothing but a hollow piece of wood, no longer capable of instilling fear or control. We can't just sweep this under the rug, can we? Tyler said softly, though his words carried the weight of an entire generation's pain. You can't go back to your chambers and pretend this didn't happen. I won't let you. For a moment, Judge Harris said nothing. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, as though the realization of his impending downfall had left him completely disoriented. The truth he had fought so hard to hide was now out in the open, and Tyler had made sure there was no way to deny it. But just as the judge seemed about to crumble completely, a sharp noise echoed through the room. The door to the courtroom swung open, and in walked a group of officials, the very people Tyler had hoped would be watching, the ones who would hold Judge Harris accountable. The real game-changer was here. The tides had shifted, and the battle was no longer just about Tyler's innocence, it was about exposing an entire system of corruption. As the officials entered the room, the judge's composure completely shattered. He knew what was coming next. Tyler had done it. He had won. But the plot was far from over. The door slammed open with a sharpness that cut through the suffocating silence in the courtroom. A group of high-ranking officials entered, their presence filling the room with a palpable sense of authority. For a moment, they stood still, taking in the scene. The tension in the air was thick, crackling with the weight of what had just been exposed. The officials exchanged looks, their eyes flicking toward the judge, whose face had now lost all color. His posture had crumbled, he looked like a man who had just realized the ground beneath him had disappeared. Tyler kept his eyes locked on Judge Harris, though his mind was racing. His hand, still gripping the camera, felt heavy with the significance of what had just happened. It wasn't just about the truth coming to light, it was about the system that had allowed men like Judge Harris to wield their power unchecked for so long. Tyler had been a victim of that system, but now, he was fighting to dismantle it, piece by piece. The judge, looking completely disoriented, tried to gather himself. His eyes flickered from the camera to the officials entering the room, his face shifting through shades of disbelief, then panic, and finally, a desperate attempt at composure. He reached for his gavel again, but his hand shook violently, and he pulled it back quickly as if the very thought of using it now seemed futile. The once mighty judge, who had stood as an unassailable figure of authority, was now reduced to a man who could only grasp at fleeting moments of control. "Is there a problem here, Judge Harris?" One of the officials, a stern woman with sharp features, stepped forward. Her voice was low and unwavering, cutting through the room like a blade. Judge Harris looked up at her, his mouth dry, words failing him for the first time in his career. His usual self-assuredness was gone, replaced by a look of pure fear. He could feel his reputation slipping away, his years of service crumbling beneath the weight of Tyler's evidence. There was nowhere to hide now. I don't understand," Judge Harris stammered, trying to piece together an explanation that would save him. This isn't what it seems. That footage, it's fabricated." The official didn't blink. She knew better than to buy into the desperate deflections of a man who had been caught in his own lies. "You don't get to control this narrative anymore," she said coldly. "The evidence is clear. Your actions have been recorded. It's all here." Tyler's heart surged with a sense of triumph, but he refused to let it consume him. This wasn't just about him. It was about everything, the countless people who had been mistreated, disregarded, and crushed under the heel of a biased system. Today, Tyler was the one standing for them, for everyone who had ever been ignored or silenced. The officials moved to examine the footage on Tyler's camera. The room was now a flurry of movement as they passed the screen around, their faces hardening with each passing second. The truth was undeniable. The footage of Judge Harris, making cruel and discriminatory remarks, was damning. The judge had belittled Tyler at every turn, questioned his character without reason, and treated him with disdain from the moment he stepped into that courtroom. The bias was evident, the arrogance palpable. In that moment, as the officials absorbed the evidence, Tyler felt a strange sense of detachment from the scene. He had never imagined this moment would come. The weight of everything he had endured, the cruel glares, the dismissive tones, the countless nights wondering if anyone would ever listen, had all led to this. But the victory didn't feel as sweet as he had expected. The officials didn't waste time. Within moments, they were speaking to each other in low, urgent tones, their hands moving quickly to make decisions. Judge Harris was being cornered, his world unraveling faster than he could keep up with. Tyler watched as the judge, who had once been the master of the courtroom, was now reduced to a nervous wreck, trying to salvage whatever shred of dignity he could. "You're finished, Harris," one of the officials said, his voice as cold as ice. "This evidence is enough to have you disbarred. We'll be looking into your conduct further. There's no place for this kind of behavior in our court system." The judge's face twisted, his mouth opening and closing in a futile attempt to respond, to explain himself, but the words didn't come. The room, once filled with the hum of the courtroom proceedings, was now deafeningly silent. No one spoke. No one needed to. Tyler stood tall, his chest rising and falling with each steady breath. He was still holding the camera, but now it felt lighter in his hand. The power had shifted. He had taken back control, not just over his own life, but over a broken system that had wronged him and so many others. His path had led him to this point, to this moment of reckoning. But as the judge was escorted out of the room, head lowered, defeated, Tyler couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. He knew this victory wasn't the end of the story. This was just one battle in a much larger war. The system that had allowed men like Judge Harris to operate unchecked wasn't going to change overnight. There would be more battles to fight, more people to expose. And yet, in that quiet moment, Tyler allowed himself a breath, just one. He had done it. He had brought the truth to light. But there was something else, something deeper than just the surface victory. It was the realization that he was no longer just a victim of the system. He had become the force that would change it. The fight was far from over, but Tyler had found his purpose. But even as he stood there, feeling the rush of victory, the sense of justice beginning to settle in, a strange feeling lingered at the back of his mind. The plot was far from over. There was something more, a twist, something unexpected that Tyler hadn't yet anticipated. But that would come later. For now, he allowed himself to simply breathe. He had won this moment, and that was enough. The courtroom was now empty save for Tyler and a few remaining officials, still whispering amongst themselves, finalizing the arrangements that would bring Judge Harris's unethical conduct to light. The air was thick with the remnants of the previous chaos, the reverberations of the confrontation still hanging in the room like an echo. Tyler stood near the back, his hand gripping the camera like a lifeline, the device that had exposed the truth, his truth, and had led to this moment. He wasn't sure what to feel. The sense of triumph that had surged through him only moments ago had started to ebb away. Yes, he had done what he set out to do. He had confronted the injustice head-on, had turned the tables, and had watched as the walls of power crumbled around the corrupt judge. But even as he stood there, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Something was missing. Tyler had been so focused on exposing the hypocrisy of Judge Harris that he hadn't fully considered what it would mean when the truth came out. In the blink of an eye, everything had changed. The very system that had imprisoned him for so long was now crumbling, but it was as if a new question had taken root in his mind. What would he do now? What did victory mean when it didn't come with any clear answers, when it didn't come with a clear sense of resolution? A quiet shuffle interrupted his thoughts, and Tyler turned to see one of the officials approaching him. The woman who had spoken earlier, the one who had cut through the chaos with such authority, now stood before him with a look of quiet respect in her eyes. "You did good today, Tyler," she said, her voice softer than before, though still imbued with the same strength that had resonated when she first entered the courtroom. "This isn't just about you anymore. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again." Tyler nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words. It wasn't just about his case, it was about the countless others who had faced the same biases, the same unfair treatment. Today had been a victory, yes, but it had also opened up a larger battle. The system wasn't going to change overnight. He knew that better than anyone. Still, for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. "Thank you," Tyler replied quietly, but the words felt hollow. They were enough for the moment, but deep down, he knew that the real work was only just beginning. There were always more battles to fight. There were always more wrongs to right. As the officials began to file out of the courtroom, taking with them the evidence that would ensure Judge Harris's career, and likely his freedom, would come to a screeching halt, Tyler lingered behind. He was hesitant, unsure whether to leave the courtroom just yet. It had been a long, painful journey to get here, and while he had won this fight, he felt as though the last few moments had left him with more questions than answers. He turned back toward the empty courtroom, his gaze landing on the empty bench where Judge Harris had once presided, so full of self-assurance. The space felt strange now, vacant and hollow. The gavel that had once echoed with authority now sat abandoned on the desk, a relic of a past that was quickly fading. But then, just as Tyler thought about turning to leave, something caught his attention. A small piece of paper was left on the judge's desk, wedged between some files. Without thinking, Tyler stepped forward, curiosity getting the better of him. He reached down and picked it up. It was a legal document, one he couldn't make out completely, but something about it made his pulse quicken. There were scribbled notes at the bottom of the page, hastily written, and his heart skipped as he began to decipher the words. Plan B, initiate backup strategy. In case of exposure, deny everything. Remain in control. No witnesses. The words seemed to blur before his eyes, the weight of them crashing over him like a flood. Tyler's stomach dropped, and for a moment, everything around him seemed to go still. What he had just uncovered was more than just a legal document. It was a contingency plan. It was a last-ditch effort to cover up the truth. In a daze, Tyler looked around the room, as if expecting someone to jump out at him, to reveal themselves as the orchestrator of the twisted web that was starting to unfold before him. The plan to discredit him had been in motion long before he had stepped into the courtroom. And now, as the judge had been exposed, it seemed that there was something even darker lurking in the background. Something even more insidious. The last few minutes, the confrontation, the release of the footage, the officials coming in, had all been part of a carefully staged act. Judge Harris might have been the face of the corruption, but there was someone else behind the curtain, pulling the strings. The deeper Tyler dug into the papers, the more he realized that the plot was far from over. His mind raced. Was there more footage hidden somewhere? Was there someone else in the system who had been feeding Judge Harris these tactics, encouraging his malfeasance? Or was this all part of a larger scheme to crush him, to make sure no one ever dared to fight back? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise from behind him. He spun around, his heart hammering in his chest, to see one of the officials, one he hadn't seen before, standing in the doorway. Their eyes locked, and Tyler felt an icy chill rush through him. The official's lips twitched into a smile, but it wasn't one of approval. It was a smile that made his blood run cold. "You've uncovered the surface, Tyler," the official said softly, "but you haven't yet seen what lies beneath." The words sent a shock through Tyler, as realizations slowly began to dawn. The true fight was far from over. And the biggest betrayal of all? It was yet to come. Tyler felt the weight of the official's words sink in as they echoed in his mind. "You've uncovered the surface, Tyler, but you haven't yet seen what lies beneath." He stood frozen, his hands still clutching the piece of paper he had discovered on the judge's desk. His heart raced, the room around him seeming to blur as a chilling realization slowly crept over him. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. The evidence he had exposed was just one piece of the puzzle. What had started as a small act of resistance against a single corrupt individual had just cracked open the door to a much larger conspiracy. The official's smile, the one that sent a cold shiver down his spine, never left their face as they stepped forward, their eyes narrowing slightly in a manner that sent a message Tyler couldn't ignore. The room, which had moments ago felt like a place of triumph and victory, suddenly felt like a trap closing in around him. "Who are you?" Tyler finally found his voice, his words laced with suspicion. The official's smile grew wider, but it wasn't friendly. It was calculating. "I'm the one who made sure your camera got into the courtroom, Tyler." His stomach dropped. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The person standing before him wasn't just a bystander. They were someone who had been orchestrating the entire situation from behind the scenes. They had let Tyler get close to the truth, only to ensure that he wouldn't be able to see the bigger picture until it was too late. "You see, Tyler, the truth isn't as simple as it seems. Your footage, it was damaging, for sure. It exposed Judge Harris, made him look like a fool. But you think that's the end of it?" The official's voice was soft, almost patronizing, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Judge Harris was just a pawn, a means to an end. You've been played from the very beginning. Tyler's mind raced. His pulse thudded in his ears. He tried to steady himself, but everything felt like it was spinning. The judge, he had been the one to hurt Tyler, to accuse him, to treat him like a criminal for something he hadn't done. It had been personal. But now it seemed that everything was connected. The conspiracy was larger than he could have ever imagined. "How long?" Tyler asked, his voice low but firm. "How long have you been setting me up?" The official tilted their head, considering him for a moment. "Longer than you think. You weren't just accused of something you didn't do, Tyler. You were targeted. Chosen." Tyler's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" The official took a step closer, their voice growing quieter, almost conspiratorial. "You were always going to be a pawn in this game, Tyler. From the moment they saw you, they knew you were perfect for the role. The perfect scapegoat." Tyler couldn't process it. His mind was reeling, the weight of the words sinking in like a slow poison. He had thought he was fighting against the corruption of a single individual, a biased judge who had made his life hell. But now, it seemed, that was just the surface. He had been set up from the very start, not just by Judge Harris, but by people much more powerful than he could have imagined. "Why?" Tyler managed to ask, though his throat felt tight. "Why me?" The official's expression remained unchanged, as if the question was almost beneath them. "Because you were expendable. You were just another pawn in the game of power. You see, Tyler, power doesn't care about justice. It never has. And people like Judge Harris, people like me, we only care about maintaining control. You were never meant to win. You were meant to play your part. Tyler felt his knees threaten to buckle. All this time, all the pain, the rejection, the humiliation, he had thought he was fighting against an individual, but he was really fighting against the system. The people pulling the strings had made sure that he never saw the bigger picture. They had manipulated him, used him, just like they had used Judge Harris. The official took a step back, as if satisfied with the disarray they had caused. But you've done your part, Tyler. You've exposed Harris. And that's good enough for us. Now the real work begins. You've outlived your usefulness. Tyler blinked, trying to make sense of it all. Outlived his usefulness? What did that mean? The official wasn't done yet. But don't worry, Tyler, they added with a twisted smile. You'll be fine. You'll get your justice. People like you always do. But as for me, I'll be gone before the dust settles. The official turned and walked toward the door, their figure already beginning to fade into the shadows. Don't bother looking for me, they called over their shoulder. You won't find me. But remember this, your fight was never just about the judge. It's about a system that won't let people like you win. You're already forgotten. You were just part of the story. The door closed behind them with a soft click, leaving Tyler standing alone in the cold, empty room. For a long moment, he stood there, unable to move, his mind spinning, his heart heavy with the weight of betrayal. But then, slowly, something clicked. The truth, in all its ugliness, had been laid bare before him. This was bigger than just Judge Harris. Bigger than just his case. This was about the system itself, the shadowy figures who pulled the strings, manipulating lives for their own gain. Tyler felt a wave of determination rise within him. The official had underestimated him. He wasn't going to let this go. Not now. Not after everything. He may have been a pawn in their game, but he wasn't going to stay that way. He wasn't done fighting. Not by a long shot. The true battle was just beginning. The system had tried to break him. But Tyler had a secret of his own. He wasn't going down without a fight.